You're not in a flood zone, but your flood insurance has just doubled. What gives? Are you confused? Look, a lot of people are confused. Why did my flood insurance just double if I'm outside the high-risk flood zone? Well, there's one rating factor that FEMA is probably not telling you about that could have a huge impact on flood insurance premiums. And in this video today, we're talking about that factor. So let's get started. But before we do, remember, share, subscribe, like the channel below. Hi, I'm Chris with the FloodInsuranceGuru. And more than a decade ago, I bought a house like this right here, and I was in the wrong flood zone. And I did not know there was one factor that could have a big impact on flood insurance premiums, and that is your flood risk score. And that's what we're talking about today. So if you're outside the flood zone, aren't flood risk scores and flood zones the same thing? No, they're actually not. We need to quickly understand what's the difference between these two. First of all, let's talk about flood zone like you see right here behind me. This is what we call a special flood hazard area. These are areas that the federal government and local communities have come to an agreement that have a higher risk of flooding. If you have a mortgage and you live in one of these areas, typically flood insurance is going to be required by your mortgage. Now the thing with these flood zones is you've got moderate, low, and high risk. Typically, if you have a mortgage, flood insurance is going to be required if you're in what's called one of these special flood hazard areas, these high risk areas. If you're on the coast, this might be a flood zone V, like Victor, or A, anything begins with A in these non-coastal areas. Now when it comes to these flood zones, look, these things might be outdated by 5, 10, 15, sometimes we've seen 20 years. The federal government likes to get these things updated every 5 years. It just doesn't always happen that way. So this is exactly what flood zones are when it comes to banks requiring flood insurance. Now let's talk about flood risk score. This is something that the federal government's probably not telling you a lot about, that private flood insurance is probably not telling you about. In fact, guess why flood risk score is so important? Because a flood zone no longer even determines your rate with the National Flood Insurance Program. The National Flood Insurance Program is looking at things like distance to water, the type of flooding. Is this river flooding? Is it flash flooding? Is it coastal flooding? The flooding frequency. They're looking at the elevation of your home, the replacement cost of your home. And this is all going in and kind of creating a score. A lot of private flood insurance companies use a scoring system. FEMA uses a lot of different factors now that go into a pool, but flood zones is not one of them. And this is why understanding your flood risk score is so important, is because it can have a major impact on your flood insurance premiums. But even if your flood zone is outdated, it can give you an idea of what's going to happen to your flood insurance premiums. What is your property going to potentially flood in the future? How to protect your property. These are all things that a flood risk score can do. So this is why it's so important to understand the difference between flood zones and flood risk scores. And here's the good news. You can click below in this video and get your flood risk score and your flood zone in less than 60 seconds on a tool that we built just for homeowners or real estate professionals like yourself to use. Now, if you want more information on understanding your flood risk score, make sure to visit our Flood Learning Center that we've built all this information for. Or you can also go ahead and just get a quote if you're ready to do that. I'm Chris with the Flood Insurance Guru, and I want to say thank you for watching today's video on flood risk scores and flood zones. Now make sure to click on the corner of this video to keep watching our playlist on understanding the National Flood Insurance Program and private flood insurance. Thank you.